What would you do if your war never ended? If everyone else went home but you kept fighting, alone in the jungle for 30 years? In December 1944, a 22-year-old Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda landed on a small Philippine island with orders that would consume his entire life. Never surrender. Fight until I return for you. His commander never returned. World War II ended in 1945. But Hiroo Onoda didn't believe it. For 29 years, he waged a one-man guerrilla war in the mountains of Lubang Island, ambushing patrols, burning rice stores. Convinced he was still serving the emperor, search parties found him and begged him to come home. He thought they were enemy tricks. Leaflets announcing Japan's surrender rained from planes. He burned them as propaganda. His family pleaded through loudspeakers. He assumed they were being tortured. By the time Hiroo Onoda finally surrendered in 1974, the world had moved on without him, and the war he'd been fighting had become a ghost. If you want to hear the most unbelievable survival story in military history, subscribe now. This is the true story of the soldier who refused to let the war end. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in a small village in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, into a world that worshipped duty above all else. He was raised on stories of samurai who chose death over dishonor, soldiers who fought to the last bullet. When war came to the Pacific, Hiroo volunteered immediately, not for glory, but because it was expected, because it was his duty. By 1944, Japan was losing badly. The Americans had retaken the Philippines. The Imperial Navy was shattered, but Japan refused to surrender, and the High Command devised a desperate strategy: guerrilla warfare. They would leave behind intelligence officers on strategic islands, soldiers trained not to win battles, but to disrupt, sabotage, and survive indefinitely behind enemy lines until Japan could counterattack. Hiroo was selected for the Nakano School, an elite intelligence academy that trained officers in espionage, propaganda, and guerrilla tactics. For 6 months, he learned how to survive in the jungle, live off the land, and resist interrogation. Most importantly, they drilled one principle into his soul: never surrender. Death before dishonor. In December 1944, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stood in a military office in Tokyo, facing Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, his commanding officer, the man who would give him his final mission. "You're being sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines," Taniguchi said, spreading a map on the desk. "The Americans will invade soon. Your orders are to conduct guerrilla operations, destroy their supplies, hamper their air operations. You are forbidden to die by your own hand. You are forbidden to surrender." Hiroo nodded. Standard orders for a guerrilla operative. But then Taniguchi said something else. Something that would haunt Hiroo for the next 3 decades. "I will come back for you, no matter how long it takes. Until I return, you keep fighting. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Hiroo replied, "even if it takes years. Even if everyone tells you the war is over. You do not surrender until I personally relieve you of your duty," Hiroo saluted. "I will wait for your return, sir." 3 weeks later, Hiroo Onoda parachuted into the jungle mountains of Lubang Island with 3 other soldiers, carrying a rifle, 200 rounds of ammunition, and orders to fight a war that, unknown to him, would never end. Lubang Island was a green hell. Dense jungle, razor-sharp limestone cliffs, mosquitoes that swarmed like clouds, and scorching heat that turned uniforms into sweat-soaked rags within hours. Hiroo and his 3 comrades, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, established a hidden camp in the mountains and began their mission. They sabotaged Filipino police patrols, burned rice stores, cut communication lines. For months they were ghosts in the jungle, striking and vanishing. But they also noticed something strange. American forces weren't pursuing them aggressively. Patrols seemed half-hearted. Then, in August 1945, the patrols stopped entirely. One morning, they found leaflets scattered across the jungle floor, dropped from American planes. Hiroo picked one up, squinting at the Japanese text. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered. All soldiers are ordered to lay down arms." The 4 men stared at the leaflet in silence. "Propaganda," Hiroo said finally, crumpling it. The Americans want us to surrender so they can execute us. Private Akatsu wasn't sure. But what if it's true? What if Japan would never surrender, Shimada cut him off. The Emperor would die first. Hiroo agreed. Everything they'd been taught, every value they held, rejected the idea that Japan could surrender. It was unthinkable. These leaflets were psychological warfare, designed to demoralize them. Major Taniguchi had warned him. The enemy would try every trick to make him give up. So they kept fighting. Months became years. The 4 soldiers lived like primitive hunters, eating coconuts, bananas, wild boar when they could kill one. They stole rice from local farms, rationed their ammunition, moved camp constantly to avoid detection. Filipino police and former Japanese soldiers who'd surrendered came into the jungle with loudspeakers, shouting messages. "The war is over. Come home, your families are waiting." Hiroo assumed these men were being coerced, possibly tortured. In 1950, Private Akatsu couldn't take it anymore. He sneaked away in the night and surrendered to Filipino authorities. The remaining 3 watched him go, knowing he'd chosen dishonor over duty. Then, in 1954, Shimada was killed by a search party, a stray bullet in a firefight. Now it was just Hiroo and Kozuka, 2 men, 20 years of war, and neither willing to believe it was over. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Hiroo Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka became legends on Lubang Island, terrifying ghosts who raided farms, burned crops, and occasionally shot at police. The locals called them the holdouts, the Japanese soldiers who refused to accept reality. The Philippine government called them dangerous criminals. But to Hiroo, they were still Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officers executing their mission. They developed an elaborate system of survival. They moved between 3 hidden camps, never staying in one place more than a few days. They repaired their rifles using salvaged metal. When their uniforms disintegrated, they sewed new ones from stolen cloth. When their boots fell apart, they made sandals from tree bark. They kept a calendar carved into bamboo, tracking the years. But the world was changing around them in ways they couldn't ignore. Airplanes overhead weren't military bombers. They were commercial jets. The villages below had electricity, cars, radios playing music Hiroo didn't recognize. Sometimes they'd steal newspapers and read about things that made no sense. Japan rebuilding. The Tokyo Olympics. Men landing on the moon. More propaganda, Hiroo would say, throwing the papers into the fire. But doubt crept in. In 1959, Hiroo's family came to Lubang with a search party. His brother shouted through a megaphone, "Hiroo! Mother is sick. Please come home." Hiroo watched through binoculars. His brother's face older, grayer. It looked real. Felt real. For the first time in 15 years, Hiroo wondered if he was wrong. Then he remembered Major Taniguchi's final order, "I will come back for you." Until his commanding officer personally relieved him, surrendering would be desertion, treason, dishonor worse than death, so they kept fighting. 2 men against an island, 2 men against time itself. In 1972, the Philippine government made one final attempt. They dropped thousands of photographs from helicopters, pictures of modern Japan, Hiroo's family, proof the war had ended 27 years ago. Hiroo and Kozuka collected them, studied them carefully. Advanced forgery, Kozuka concluded. Agreed, Hiroo said. 3 months later, on October 19, 1972, Kozuka was shot and killed by Philippine police during a raid on a rice paddy. And suddenly, Hiroo Onoda was alone, the last soldier of a war that had ended before most people on the island were even born. For the first time in 28 years, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. No comrades, no orders. Just him, the jungle, and a mission that consumed his entire existence. He was 50 years old. His hair was turning gray. His body was scarred from decades of insect bites, infections, and near starvation. But his rifle was still clean. His uniform, hand-sewn from stolen fabric, still bore the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army. He spoke to himself now. Recited military protocols allowed to keep his mind sharp, counted his remaining ammunition, 47 rounds, and debated whether he should save them for combat or hunting. He wondered if Major Taniguchi was dead, if Japan had truly lost, if his entire adult life had been wasted fighting a ghost. But surrender was unthinkable. He'd seen what happened to soldiers who surrendered. Akatsu had vanished, probably executed. The others who'd given up were likely imprisoned or brainwashed. No, Hiroo would keep his honor. He would wait for orders, no matter how long it took. Then, in February 1974, something impossible happened. Hiroo was checking one of his camouflaged supply caches when he heard footsteps. Not the heavy boots of soldiers, light, clumsy steps. A hiker, lost probably. Hiroo raised his rifle, ready to retreat, when a young Japanese man stepped into the clearing. Hands raised, smiling like an idiot. "Lieutenant Onoda?" The man called out in Japanese. "I'm not your enemy. My name is Norio Suzuki. I'm looking for you." Hiroo didn't lower his rifle. "Who sent you?" "No one sent me," Suzuki said, still smiling. "I came on my own. I'm a traveler. I wanted to find 3 things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. I found the panda. Couldn't find the Yeti." "But I found you!" Hiroo stared at this strange young man who spoke about pandas and Yetis like they mattered more than war. Suzuki pulled out a camera and snapped a photograph before Hiroo could stop him. "The war is over," Suzuki said gently. "It ended in 1945. Japan lost. But you're not a criminal. You're a hero. People want you to come home." Hiroo shook his head. "I have orders. I cannot surrender until my commanding officer relieves me." Suzuki's smile faded. "Then I'll bring him to you." Norio Suzuki kept his promise. He returned to Japan and tracked down Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now 69 years old, retired, living quietly in a small apartment in Tokyo. When Suzuki explained that Lieutenant Onoda was still alive, still fighting, still waiting for orders, Taniguchi wept. "I never thought," the old man whispered. "I never imagined he'd take my orders so literally." On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi landed on Lubang Island, accompanied by Suzuki, Philippine officials, and Japanese diplomats. They hiked into the mountains, calling Hiroo's name. Hours passed. Then, from the jungle shadows, a figure emerged. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stepped into the clearing wearing a tattered but meticulously maintained uniform, his rifle slung across his back, standing at attention. He looked like a ghost from 1944, thin, weathered, but his eyes were sharp, alert, unbroken. Taniguchi stepped forward, barely recognizing the young officer he'd sent into the jungle 3 decades ago. "Lieutenant Onoda," Taniguchi said, voice trembling. "I have returned as promised." Hiroo saluted. Tears streamed down his face, but his posture remained rigid. "Perfect." "Sir." "Awaiting orders, sir." Taniguchi pulled out a typed document, official orders, stamped with the seal of the Japanese government. His hands shook as he read, "Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, by order of the Imperial Japanese Army and the government of Japan, your mission on Lubang Island is complete. You are hereby relieved of all combat duties. The war is over. You are ordered to surrender your weapon and return home." Silence. The jungle held its breath. Hiroo unbuckled his rifle, an Arisaka Type 99, still functional after 29 years, and handed it to Taniguchi. Then he removed his sword, his ammunition, his hand grenades, placing each item carefully on the ground like sacred relics. "Permission to speak, sir?" Hiroo asked. "Granted, did we win?" Taniguchi's face crumbled. "No, Lieutenant. We lost." Hiroo nodded slowly, absorbing this truth he'd refused to believe for 3 decades. Japan had lost. The Emperor had surrendered. Everything he'd fought for every year in the jungle. Every comrade who died. It had all been for a war that ended before he turned 24. And now, at age 52, Hiroo Onoda had to figure out how to live in a world that had moved on without him. The formal surrender ceremony took place on March 10, 1974, at the Philippine military headquarters on Lubang Island. Hiroo Onoda wore his hand-sewn uniform, now cleaned and pressed for the first time in decades. He stood at attention before Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who had granted him a full pardon for the 30 Filipino civilians and police killed during his 3-decade guerrilla campaign. Hiroo presented his sword in the traditional military fashion, bowing deeply. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions in languages he barely understood. The entire world was watching this impossible moment. A soldier from 1944 stepping directly into 1974, skipping 30 years of history. President Marcos accepted the sword and said, "You have been a soldier. I respect that. You are forgiven." But Hiroo wasn't sure he could forgive himself. The flight back to Japan was surreal. Hiroo stared out the window at the Boeing 747, a machine that seemed impossible, like something from science fiction. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, the same water he'd flown over as a young lieutenant 3 decades ago. But everything else had changed. When the plane landed in Tokyo, 10,000 people were waiting. They cheered. They waved flags. They called him a hero, the embodiment of Japanese loyalty and dedication. But Hiroo felt like a fraud. What kind of hero wastes 30 years fighting a war that's already over? What kind of soldier kills innocent people defending a cause that lost before he understood it was finished? He met his family, his parents elderly and frail, his siblings middle-aged with children of their own. They embraced him, weeping, but Hiroo felt disconnected, like he was watching the reunion happen to someone else. These people had lived full lives while he'd been frozen in 1944, and now he was expected to just fit in. The Japan he returned to was unrecognizable. Tokyo was a neon metropolis of skyscrapers and highways. People wore strange clothes, listened to rock music, watched television shows about nothing important. The emperor was no longer a living god, but a figurehead. Young people criticized the government openly, something that would have been treason in Hiroo's youth. Japan had become wealthy, modern, peaceful. Everything the war was supposedly fought to prevent, and nobody seemed to care about honor anymore. Hiroo tried to adapt. He wrote a book about his experience that became a bestseller. He gave speeches about duty and perseverance. But privately, he was drowning. He couldn't sleep without a weapon nearby. Loud noises made him reach for rifles that weren't there. He distrusted everyone, assuming smiles were manipulation. Kindness was weakness. The jungle had made him feral, and civilization felt like a trap. In 1975, Hiroo left Japan. He couldn't bear it anymore, the noise, the crowds, the meaninglessness of modern life. He moved to Brazil and bought a cattle ranch in the remote countryside, where he could live simply, away from cameras and questions and the weight of being a living fossil. For decades, Hiroo lived in isolation, raising cattle, speaking to almost no one. He married a Japanese woman who understood his need for solitude. He never apologized for the Filipinos he'd killed. He'd been following orders, executing his duty. To apologize would mean his entire life had been a mistake, and he couldn't accept that. But in 1996, something changed. Hiroo returned to Lubang Island and donated $10,000 to the local school, a small attempt at restitution for the suffering he'd caused. He met with families of the people he'd killed. He didn't say sorry, but he bowed deeply, and they understood. In his final years, Hiroo became a survival instructor, teaching young people wilderness skills and discipline. He wrote that the most important lesson he'd learned wasn't about loyalty or duty. It was about knowing when to let go. About understanding that holding on to the past, no matter how honorable it seemed, could destroy your future. On January 16, 2014, Hiroo Onoda died of heart failure in Tokyo. He was 91 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including Philippine officials who praised his courage despite the pain he'd caused. What do we do with a story like this? How do we judge a man who was so loyal, so dedicated, that he wasted half his life fighting for a cause that no longer existed? Hiroo Onoda wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He killed innocent people. He refused to accept reality. He clung to orders that should have been questioned the moment the war ended. But he was also the ultimate embodiment of what his culture demanded: absolute loyalty, unbreakable will, duty above all else. He did exactly what he was trained to do. And the fact that it was tragic doesn't make it less real. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. When does duty become delusion? When does loyalty become madness? How do we honor the past without being imprisoned by it? And what happens to soldiers when the wars they fight turn out to be mistakes? Hiroo Onoda spent 29 years fighting a war that ended before he understood what he was fighting for. But in a way, he never stopped fighting. Not because he was stupid or brainwashed, but because surrendering meant admitting his entire adult life had been meaningless. And that's a surrender no one wants to make. The jungle didn't break Hiroo Onoda. What broke him was coming home and realizing the world had moved on without him, that everything he'd sacrificed, every friend who'd died, every year in hell, hadn't mattered to anyone except him. Think about the veterans in your own life, the ones who came home from wars that never made sense, carrying orders they still follow in their nightmares. Hiroo Onoda's story is extreme, but the question is universal. How do we let go of the past and still honor what it cost us? If this story made you think, hit subscribe. Drop a comment about what duty means to you, and when it's okay to let it go. Share this video so people remember Hiroo Onoda, not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who followed orders until they destroyed him. He fought for 30 years because no one told him he could stop. The least we can do is make sure his story isn't forgotten.